The conference room was 42 floors above downtown Chicago, and Owen Castellan had never felt so small in a room built entirely of glass. 6 members of the Whitfield family sat across from him, their expressions arranged with the kind of practiced neutrality that only old money could afford. The youngest of them couldn't have been younger than 50, and yet they all carried themselves like they had been born into boardrooms instead of nurseries. At the center of the table sat a single folder, and inside it was the number that had kept Owen awake for the better part of 3 weeks, $1.1 billion. For a logistics software company that he had built out of a garage in Cicero, while his daughter napped in a portable crib beside his desk, a silver-haired attorney slid the folder the final few inches toward him without bothering to make eye contact. $1.1 billion, Mr. Castellan. Full transfer of operational control, effective immediately upon signature. Owen didn't reach for it yet. He let the number sit in the air the way you let a hot pan cool before you touch it. $1 billion. More than he'd ever let himself imagine back when he was reading freight manifests by the light of his phone because the apartment's electricity had been shut off twice that winter. He turned the page anyway because something about the silence in the room told him the number wasn't the whole story. It wasn't. Buried under 3 pages of legal phrasing was the truth of it. They weren't acquiring his company so much as quietly removing him from it. Chairman Emeritus, advisory capacity only, a title with no weight behind it like a coat rack shaped like a man. Desmond Whitfield, the family patriarch, leaned back in his chair with the kind of smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. You should be proud of what you've built, Owen. Truly. But let's be honest with each other. Men who build things this fast rarely know how to hold on to them. Better to cash out while the world still thinks you're a genius. A low chuckle moved around the table, careful and rehearsed, the kind of laughter people perform when they already know they've won. Across from him, Desmond's daughter, Margot, didn't laugh at all. She just watched Owen the way you'd study a used car before deciding what to offer for it. And that was the moment the humiliation found him. Not loud, not a single cutting remark he could push back against, but a slow erasure happening in real time, page by page, smile by smile. His hand drifted to his jacket pocket out of habit, and his thumb found the edge of his phone before his mind caught up to what he was doing. He pulled it out just enough to see the lock screen. Lily. 6 years old, gap-toothed, sitting on the kitchen counter the week before, laughing at something off-camera that Owen couldn't even remember anymore. She had no idea what a room like this looked like. She had no idea what it cost to keep her in the apartment 2 blocks from her school, the one with the good light in the mornings. Something in his chest stopped shaking and went still instead. He closed the folder. The sound of it was small, but in a room built to swallow sound, it landed like a door slamming somewhere far away. Every head at the table lifted. Then you're not buying my company, Owen said, and his voice came out quieter than he expected, which somehow made it land harder. You're asking me to hand over the only reason I built it in the first place. Desmond's smile flickered, just barely, like a light bulb, deciding whether it was going to hold. Owen stood, buttoned his jacket out of some old reflex his father used to drill into him, and walked out without looking back, though he could feel 6 pairs of eyes following him all the way to the elevator. The doors closed and his reflection looked back at him in the brushed steel. Tired eyes, loosened tie. A man who had just turned down more money than most people see across 3 lifetimes. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt like he'd stepped off a ledge and hadn't hit the ground yet. Outside, Chicago didn't care. Cabs leaned on their horns, a vendor was yelling about hot pretzels $2 cheaper than the cart down the block, and somewhere above him an L train screeched around a curve like it always did. The city had no idea that a man had just walked away from a fortune on the 42nd floor, and somehow that indifference was steadying. His phone buzzed. A text from Lily's after-school program. Pick-up reminder. Don't forget the parent-teacher sign-up sheet today. He stood there a second longer than he needed to, letting that single ordinary sentence cut through everything that had just happened in that glass room. No matter how big the number had been, his life didn't orbit around the Whitfields. It orbited around a 6-year-old who thought her dad could fix anything with duct tape and patience. He tucked the phone away and started walking toward the L, toward the apartment that smelled like the neighbors cooking in the stairwell and had a porch light that buzzed if you didn't jiggle the switch just right. When he opened the door, the apartment greeted him in its usual chaos. Markers scattered across the rug, one shoe missing its pair by the radiator, and Lily cross-legged in the middle of the floor, with a drawing spread out in front of her, tongue poking out the corner of her mouth in total concentration. She heard the door and her head snapped up. "Daddy!" She launched herself at him with the kind of force only a 6-year-old can manage without warning, and Owen caught her, lifted her, and for the first time since he'd walked into that boardroom, he let himself actually smile. "Hey, Peanut." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. She pulled back and studied his face the way she always did, like she was checking for cracks. "You look tired. Big meeting." He kept it simple. She didn't need to know about transfer of control clauses or men who smiled like sharks. She nodded like that, explained everything, and tugged him down to the floor by the hand. "I made something." She slid the drawing toward him with the kind of quiet pride that made his throat tighten before he even looked at it. It wasn't just a child's sketch. It was a story. A stick figure of him standing in front of a tall building, holding her hand, both of them grinning too wide to be realistic. Above them, in crooked, determined letters, "My dad fixes things." For a second, the room felt heavier than the one he'd just left because there was no negotiation in it, no angle, no fine print, just truth. "This is perfect," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "You always fix things," she said, matter of fact, like she was reading him the weather, "even when they're broken really bad." He closed his eyes for a second and let that land. That was the version of him she saw. Not a CEO under siege, not a man who'd just lost, or one he genuinely didn't know yet, $1 billion. Just someone who fixed what mattered. That was when the doubt slid back in, sharper this time. Maybe walking out hadn't been strength. Maybe it had just been pride wearing strength's jacket. The world outside this apartment didn't reward principle. It rewarded leverage, and he'd just thrown his away. His phone buzzed again. This time a string of messages from his team, piling up faster than he could read them. "Did you actually walk away? Tell me this is a rumor. Call me the second you see this." Lily noticed the shift in him instantly. Her small hand found his forearm. "Is it bad?" He looked down at her, really looked, and saw she wasn't asking for information. She was asking for reassurance, and he wasn't going to make her carry weight that wasn't hers to carry. "No," he said steadier than he felt. "It's just a lot of grown-up stuff." She accepted that the way kids accept things when they trust you completely, then picked her crayon back up and added something to the drawing without a word. When she held it up again, there was a big circle now, looping around both figures. "That's our bubble," she explained. "Nothing bad gets in." Owen let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Later that night, after dinner, after 2 dishes sat drying in the rack because he hadn't gotten to the rest yet, after Lily had fallen asleep with her head against his arm on the couch, Owen sat in the gray light of his phone scrolling through the wreckage, investors questioning his judgment, a blog post already speculating about his mental state, and one message from a number he didn't recognize. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." Maybe they were right. The Whitfields didn't lose. They crushed what they couldn't own, and by walking out, Owen hadn't just declined an offer. He'd challenged a machine that wasn't built to tolerate defiance. But Lily's hand was still fisted in the fabric of his shirt, even asleep. And he understood something with total clarity. Whatever came next, he'd face it the way he'd faced everything since the day she was born. Not chasing approval, not chasing a number, but protecting the one thing actually worth protecting. The silence the next morning was the loud kind. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that follows impact. Calls that didn't get returned. Conversations that stopped the second he walked into a room. By the time he reached his own conference room, his team was already seated, and the tension was thick enough to chew. His CFO, a sharp, exhausted woman named Renata Cho, leaned forward first. "Tell me this isn't final, Owen. Tell me there's still a door to open." He didn't sit right away. He looked around at the faces, people who'd worked weekends, believed in something that hadn't existed yet until he and they built it together, and he shook his head slowly. "It's final." The reaction wasn't an explosion. It was worse. It was quiet. One of the senior engineers exhaled hard and leaned back. "Do you have any idea what that money could have done for us?" "For our roadmap, our runway, literally everything." He did know. He knew exactly what it could have done, and exactly what it would have taken in exchange, something none of them could see in a spreadsheet because it wasn't written in numbers. It was written in who got to decide when the company became next. Renata leaned in again. "This isn't only your call anymore, Owen. We have people with families depending on payroll." That landed harder than anything Desmond Whitfield had said across that polished table, because this wasn't an enemy trying to break him. This was his own people, and that cut differently. "I didn't walk away from an opportunity," he said quietly. "I walked away from losing this company while still technically owning it on paper." A few heads tilted, confusion working its way through the frustration. "They weren't investing in us," he went on. "They were buying the steering wheel. Every decision, every direction. It stops being ours the second that ink dries." Renata frowned. And now it might not exist long enough to matter either way. He didn't argue because it was true. The runway was thinner than it had ever been, and the timing couldn't have been worse. His phone buzzed against the table, a notification, then another, then a third in rapid succession. A logistics partner pulling out of a signed pilot, no explanation given, just clinical legal language that reeked of outside pressure. The Whitfields had already started. They're coming after us, Renata said, looking up slowly, her earlier frustration replaced by something graver. I know, Owen said. Nobody spoke for a long moment because this wasn't theory anymore. It was a slow, deliberate war, and the worst part was how quietly it could be waged. No lawsuits, no headlines, just pressure applied in exactly the right places until something cracked on its own. Give me 48 hours, he said finally. If I can't stabilize this, we revisit everything, all of it. No ego. Renata held his gaze a long beat, weighing trust against fear before nodding. 48 hours. That night, when he got home late, Lily was at the kitchen table with her homework spread out, and she looked up the second she heard the door. You're late, she said, not as an accusation, just a fact she was logging. I know, he said, kneeling beside her chair, setting his bag down. She slid a math worksheet toward him with quiet pride. I did all of it myself. He glanced at the numbers and managed a real laugh. Looks like you're smarter than me already. She grinned, satisfied, then hesitated. Did your meeting go good today? There it was again, a question with more weight in it than anything his board had thrown at him all week. It was hard, he said honestly, gently. Hard things are okay, she said quietly, almost to herself, already reaching for a crayon. Something in his chest settled at that, steadier than it had been all day, because while the outside world measured success in deal terms and dominance, this small apartment measured it in honesty and showing up. After she fell asleep, he opened his laptop and pulled up files he hadn't shown his own team yet, and he understood that walking out of that boardroom hadn't been the final move. It had only been the opening one. The email that changed everything arrived at 5:08 in the morning, no drama attached to it, just a quiet notification glowing in the dark kitchen while Owen sat with a coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. Sender. Whitfield Capital. Subject line. Final notice. He read it line by line. Acquisitions quietly blocked. Partnerships delayed for compliance review. A regulatory inquiry that had mysteriously reopened after 18 months of dormancy. Nothing illegal, nothing loud. Just patient, surgical pressure applied everywhere it could reach. And at the bottom, one sentence colder than the rest. We believe you will reconsider your position. It wasn't retaliation. It was a message. You don't walk away from us without a cost. By the time Lily wandered into the kitchen asking for waffles like the world was perfectly fine, Owen had already made a decision. Not surrender, not yet, but something just as difficult. He was going to fight, not emotionally, strategically. 3 hours later, his own conference room looked smaller and rougher than the one he'd left days earlier, but the tension in it was just as sharp. His team sat around the table, exhausted, waiting. We're running out of runway, Renata said. If this keeps escalating, we lose the leverage to negotiate anything at all. One of the engineers added, low and flat, they're choking us out piece by piece. Owen nodded once, acknowledging it, then stepped forward and put both hands flat on the table, looking at each of them, not as employees, but as people who had trusted him with their actual lives. Then we stop reacting, he said, and we start moving. Confusion flickered across a few faces, but he didn't wait for it to clear, because the plan had already been forming for weeks, quietly, in the part of his mind that never stopped working even when he was reading bedtime stories. The Whitfields had made one mistake. They believed they understood his leverage. They didn't understand his actual asset. What Owen had built wasn't just routing software. It was a predictive logistics engine capable of forecasting supply disruptions, fraud patterns, and shipping failures months before they happened, with an accuracy no competitor had come close to matching, and he had only ever shown the world about a third of what it could actually do. Not out of caution, out of timing. He hadn't been ready to reveal the rest until he had no other choice. Now he had no other choice. Over the next 2 days, everything moved fast and quiet. Calls to contacts he'd kept warm for years without using. Term sheets drafted in encrypted threads at midnight. Closed-door meetings with no press, no current investors, and absolutely no Whitfield representatives in the building. By the third morning, whispers had already started moving through the industry. Not headlines, just murmurs that Owen Castellan wasn't folding, he was building something. When the invitation finally came from Whitfield Capital requesting a further conversation, the tone had changed. Still composed, no longer dismissive. Owen walked back into that same glass boardroom, but this time he didn't stand at the far end of the table like a man waiting to be judged. He sat down, uninvited but unquestioned, because real leverage doesn't announce itself. It just takes a seat and waits. When the Whitfield family filed in, their expressions were carefully arranged into neutral, but the air had a different weight to it now, the kind that exists when both sides know something has shifted, and neither wants to be the one to say it first. Margot broke the silence. "You've been busy," she said, "not a question." "So have you," Owen replied, and let the silence after that statement do the rest of the work. He reached into his bag and set a thin folder on the table, sliding it forward with a calm that drew every eye in the room. "You wanted to buy my company," he said. "You never actually understood what you were buying." As the documents were opened, the shift in the room became unmistakable, not theatrical, just undeniable. This wasn't a feature update. It was a fully realized platform, already backed by partnerships finalized quietly with companies that had never needed Whitfield approval to begin with. Desmond leaned forward, his expression tightening as he flipped through the pages. "This isn't possible," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone at the table. "It already is," Owen said, meeting his eyes without flinching. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before it, because the dynamic in the room had fully reversed, not because Owen had more money, but because he had something they couldn't replicate and couldn't control. Margot closed the folder slowly, her eyes lifting to his calculation, replacing certainty. "What do you want?" Owen let the question sit there a moment before answering, wanting them to feel its full weight. "Respect," he said finally, "and full control over what I built. Nothing else is on the table." Something crossed Margot's face, not agreement, not yet, but recognition, the first real acknowledgement that she was no longer dictating terms. Desmond exhaled and leaned back, studying Owen with a different kind of attention now, not as a target, but as a variable he'd badly miscalculated. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "No," Owen said quietly. "I'm making it exactly what it should have been from the start." When the meeting ended, there was no signature, no handshake deal, just an unmistakable shift in the air as Owen stood and gathered his things. Nobody laughed on his way out this time. As his hand found the door handle, Margot's voice stopped him, softer than before. "Mr. Castellan." When he turned, her expression had something new in it, something closer to respect than calculation. "We'll be in touch." He nodded once, not as a man seeking approval, but as an equal acknowledging a conversation that had permanently changed shape. The headlines didn't disappear overnight, but they softened, shifting slowly from shock to something closer to admiration. Not the story of a man who turned down $1 billion, but the story of a father who refused to lose himself chasing a win. In the weeks that followed, the pressure that had nearly crushed the company started transforming into something else entirely. Partners who'd watched quietly from the sidelines started reaching out. Talent that valued vision over control started applying. And slowly the foundation Owen had built on his own terms started growing sturdier than it ever could have under someone else's name. None of that felt as real to him, though, as the quiet evenings at home, where success wasn't measured in valuation but in presence. In Lily sitting beside him with her crayons while he worked, glancing up every so often just to make sure he was still there. He always was. That had become his real definition of winning. One evening, with the city lights blinking on outside their window, Lily climbed up beside him on the couch, holding the same drawing from weeks before, a little more wrinkled now but still bright with color. She set it gently in his hands. "Did your big meeting work out?" she asked, her voice quiet, curious. Owen looked down at the drawing, the two stick figures inside her crooked circle, and smiled, not the kind of smile he used in boardrooms, but something steadier, something that came from somewhere deeper. "Yeah," he said softly, pulling her in closer. "It worked." She nodded, satisfied, and rested her head against his shoulder, her breathing slowing into sleep as the city settled outside the window. Owen sat there a long time without moving, the noise of the world outside fading into something distant and unimportant, because for the first time in his life he understood, with total clarity, that success was never about how much you could gain. It was about how much of yourself you got to keep.